Well, hello, good people. It's the Big Heavy, and I've been in the midst of doing a major home office remodel over the past couple months at this point. And one of the big decisions I had to make over the course of that remodel was around essentially where do I put all my stuff? Like most people, I have everything from cameras and tripods and various accoutrements for this YouTube thing to, the boring kind of home office stuff that most of us have, from inboxes to manila files to pens and paper and all that sort of crud. I'll have a future video that walks through what I actually came up with in my home office, but what I was ultimately going for was kind of a clean sort of look. I wanted something that felt light and airy, and when I walked in each morning, kind of felt like I was starting from a clean slate and ready to get down to business. And I struggled with the whole question of where do I put all my stuff, and ultimately settled on a wall-mounted shelving system from a company called Vitsoe. And I had never heard of these guys. I think I spent, like you are now, hours watching what I would call home office porn on YouTube. And one of those videos had this lovely white shelving, looked really cool, was kind of elevated off the ground and wall mounted. And that ultimately got me going down this Vitsoe rabbit hole. So in this video, I want to talk you through my decision process that ultimately led me to Vitsoe. I'll early on in the video jump right into pricing, which is a bit of a big consideration for this product. I'll walk you through some of the things I picked up along the way in terms of designing the system, doing the installation, and ultimately how I've started to use the shelves now that I've got them set up in my office. And finally, leave you with some pros and cons and kind of tips and tricks and whether I would go through the expense of choosing a Vitsoe system again if I had to do it all over. Furthermore, I also wanted whatever storage system I came up with to have a little bit of counter space. I have a nice big desk in my new office, and that's great for kind of getting the day-to-day work done. But I also end up, having a little bit of secondary counter space that I like to use for everything from sorting through mail, kind of go through and open everything up, put the junk in one corner, the stuff I have to act on another corner, the stuff I have to scan. So I wanted some counter space to do that. I wanted some counter space for little projects I'm working on. Right now I'm tinkering around with ESP32 devices, which are little, wireless IoT type boards that you can do interesting things with. And I also wanted the ability to reconfigure that space as I needed to. One of the things I didn't like about my previous setup, which was this big, heavy sort of dark wood bookshelf type structure, was it had some things that were really thoughtful 15 years ago when I bought the setup, but now we're a little less relevant. Things like a space for a big tower computer, a big sliding keyboard tray, which, I think most people have gotten away from. So wanted that ability to kind of change things up and have the system grow and evolve as I tweaked my home office setup or, kind of changed how I use the space. So after all this research, I basically came down to kind of three options for that storage space in my home office. I didn't want to do, generic furniture. I didn't want to do stuff that was kind of made of, sawdust and particle board and that sort of thing in the Far East. I was trying to go with things that were sourced in North America or close to home. And I kind of broke it down to, getting a custom made credenza. So, essentially a big, nice piece of furniture, kind of a cabinet with some front storage that you could open up and put things in. And then obviously that big chunk of counter that kind of met my needs. That wouldn't necessarily scratch my itch in terms of shelving for books, collectibles, and storing other stuff, but it'd give me a nice big hunk of storage. It would look, presumably beautiful if I chose correctly from the right craftsperson, and that was kind of option one. Option two that I thought about was doing built-ins, and obviously built-ins, look nice, they're part of the room, all that stuff. The negatives I found with built-ins was you were kind of stuck with whatever configuration you went with. It wasn't easy to say if you had, one large open shelf to close that in or to make it smaller, something like that. And it would also mess up the flow of the room a little bit. The place I was looking at for my shelves was kind of one side of the room. I have two big French doors that come into the office. So if I bumped out one of those walls in order to accommodate built-in bookshelves, the room would be a little off. The doors would no longer take you into the center of the room. They'd kind of take you a little bit off to the side. I'd lose, 18 inches to a couple feet of floor space. And, ultimately that was something I didn't go towards. And the final category, which I'd explored a little bit before running into the Vitsoe stuff on YouTube, was wall-mounted shelving. There's a system, I think from Denmark in the 60s or 70s that's made out of teak and looks quite beautiful. I think IKEA has something that kind of is wall-mounted. I've seen some people use the Alpha system from Container Store, which we have in our closets today, and kind of repurpose that into a home office storage setup. So I was kind of aware of these things and had looked at a few of them, but didn't find any that I really loved until I saw that Vitsoe system. So once I discovered Vitsoe and kind of saw the stuff, it clearly looked nice. That little spidey sense and tingling I get in the back of my brain that says, this is gonna be expensive, started to wake up. And you'll probably get that sense if you've never heard of Vitsoe, if you go out to their website, they have this weird branding where the letters are mashed together. I'm surprised they didn't throw an umlaut or something in there just for good measure. You go to the website and it's very kind of high design and clearly emphasizes the pedigree of the designers that built the thing. They have fancy looking people with wire-rimmed glasses doing videos about the soul of design, and probably their typical customer base, instead of watching big dumb animals like yours truly, watches highfalutin design videos that might look a little bit something like this.
Throughout the history of man, shelving has been less about a vertical plane on which to store the detritus of everyday life, and more about the separation from the ground and the sky, the yin and the yang of earth and space, and not our mere physical possessions, but those things which encapsulate our soul and give us meaning, transcending the spirit into a physical form that we can place not merely on the physical plane, but on the spiritual, creating a transcendence and a harmony that exists deeply and profoundly within our environment and our spaces, which we call an abode.
So, clearly I'm not necessarily in their target demographic. I do like nicely designed stuff. I have worked with wire-rimmed European accent design type people in the past. I make fun of them in that little video segment I just did, but I'm glad the world has people that spend their lives dedicated to making the perfect shelf or the perfect whatever, and think about aesthetics and beauty and product design and all that stuff. So the world needs big dumb animals, and it also needs designers and all that stuff. So I'm glad that those people are out there. But again, you get that little spidey sense browsing their website that this stuff is going to be expensive. And I won't make you watch to the end of the video to talk about pricing. Actually right now I'll kind of flash up what my system ultimately ended up costing me. And Vitsoe's, I think, unintentionally sort of strange about pricing. So on one hand, they're very transparent. You can go to their website, you can see a complete catalog of all the different pieces and parts that make up their shelving system that has a full price list. They claim on their website that they don't do any special pricing. If you're an architect or a designer or a big dumb animal on YouTube, apparently you pay the same price as everyone else. I obviously didn't even try, but didn't get any special pricing. I kind of paid full boat, as you can see. And they'll happily give you a quote immediately once you go through the design process, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But where they're kind of not transparent about pricing, and I don't know if this is intentional or not, is you'll see all these beautiful pictures on their website of different shelving systems. Most of the stuff they kind of show as examples on the website is quite elaborate and gets a little bit expensive. And they don't kind of give you a, hey, here's a super cool shelf, it costs X. Here's another example, it costs Y. You kind of have to assemble that information for yourself and do a little bit of detective work, or alternatively go through the design process before you can get a price quote. Now, as you saw, my setup was a bit over $7,000, which is kind of shocking, frankly, that I spent that much money on shelves. That's as much as multiple weapons of non-mass destruction. That's as much as a half-decent used motorcycle. I could probably get a tricked out Honda Civic with a big soup bowl exhaust system from, say 2004 for that kind of dough. So it was a bit of a, kick in the nuts, quite frankly, to spend that much money on shelving. And Vitsoe kind of helps you justify the purchase price in your own head through some of their stuff on their website. And maybe it's marketing fluff. I think there are a few points that resonated with me. Probably the first being that they've had the same design essentially and the same components since I think the mid or late 60s. So if you bought a system in 1965 or whatever, and you still have it hanging on your wall, you can buy a new shelf today, or you can buy a storage bin or whatever and put it on that same system. So theoretically there's a longevity to the system that frankly when I looked at some of their competitors didn't have. IKEA has a similar wall-mounted shelf system, and I guess they just changed it a couple or 3 years ago. Completely changed the mounting system, completely changed kind of everything about it. So if you had the old system, you were up the creek. Similarly, I found this Kickstarter company that was vowing to kind of make a cheaper Vitsoe and do the same nice design, but at a significantly lower cost. And I think they lasted a couple or 3 years and then went out of business. So again, if you had their system, you're sort of up the creek. If you love it, you're set up great, but if a piece breaks or you need something, again, you're kind of up the creek. And Vitsoe hypes up the fact that, is true, and you'll have to call me in 20 years and see if I've actually taken advantage of this, that you can, take the system down if you move, you can reconfigure it. They talk about people sending their kids off to college and kind of disassembling their system and giving pieces to each of them. I'm certainly not gonna send some hunk of $7,000 shelving off to my kids' college, knowing the types of activities I did in college and the trail of destruction that followed me around wherever I went. But, it is possible. I'm thinking in 10, 15 years, maybe if I downsize, I could bring hunks of that system and have it cover a couple rooms. They show people reconfiguring a bookshelf into something in your kitchen and all that stuff. So theoretically, there is some kind of reusability and recyclability to the product. That's a little more appealing than buying some massive credenza that maybe isn't relevant if we moved into a smaller place. Clearly, if you buy a built-in, you're sort of stuck with it and not going to rip it out if you move or whatnot. So that makes the kick in the balls level pricing a little bit more palatable, at least theoretically. I also do like the fact that you can reconfigure this. If I bought the big beautiful credenza or bought the built-in, you're kind of stuck with what you got. This thing, there's already a couple minor little tweaks I would make that I'll talk about later in the video. But if after a year, when I kind of am doing my big, massive office clean out and sort of take everything out, if I find out that I need additional shelving or maybe I want to move a cabinet from one spot to another, it's basically a matter of just unloading that cabinet, getting a helper, kind of popping it off its track, moving it around, and you can kind of have this system grow or change or modify as your needs grow and change. Now, another thing they emphasize as part of their pricing is that they have, workers that I think are in England or somewhere in the United Kingdom, and they live in this energy neutral place, and there's unicorns romping around, and everyone eats organic kale for lunch and smiles gleefully at the prospect of coming into work and all this stuff. And on one hand, I think that fit with the ethos of my home office design, where I was trying not to do, just mass-produced junk that I was going to end up throwing away in 5 or 10 years. On the other hand, the evil, consultancy lizard man part of my brain says, hey, if you just took all that stuff out, moved everything to Asia, you could probably produce this at 80% of the quality and 40% of the price.
Excellent.
Which is nice from a bargain basement perspective, but again, maybe it's the marketing fluff, but I guess part of me is happy that there's some, lovely craftsperson in the UK who hopefully has a very elaborate and impressive uniform and, has worked at this company for 20 years and knows everything about shelves. And he or she has a livelihood building shelves versus sending this to the lowest cost provider and, some sort of sweatshop somewhere else in the world. So if you've already kind of been ruled out of the market solely based on price, Vitsoe kind of hypes up, hey, buy 1 or 2 pieces today, and then you can add as you go. I guess that would work, but then you have sort of a half-ass storage system, and hopefully you make it full-ass over the not too distant future. But if you end up only buying 1 or 2 components, maybe that doesn't quite meet your needs today. So with that out of the way, let's talk through the ordering process. And basically, as far as I can tell, Vitsoe doesn't really have canned configurations. What you do is go through a little questionnaire on your website. It kind of asks you, what is your space? Give us some measurements. Ideally, you send them a picture. They ask you where outlets, baseboards, kind of all the things that you would expect are on your wall where you're going to install this thing. And then they ask you for a few sentences on how you're going to use this thing. And they hype up this process quite a bit. They have nice black and white, beautiful, artsy pictures of all their design helpers. They talk about all their hobbies and things they love and how they, design some very nuanced system for some particular customer's use case. So I was kind of pumped up, and I went through, I kind of put in what I wanted to do with the system, some of the stuff I wanted to store. They ask you for kind of your price point. So, they will do an initial draft of a shelving system that's close-ish to your price point. So I put all this stuff in, was super jazzed. Generally the turnover on those interactions seems to be about 24 hours. And after 24 hours, I got, initial design. The person sort of said, hey, here it is. Let me know what you think. There wasn't a lot of like, hey, you said you're gonna store camera equipment, you really should think about this component or that component. And I was hoping for a little more around, kind of tips and tricks, and here's what, other people that have mentioned similar things to you have done. Here's little tweaks, or, I really like to use this component versus that component. So that part of the process, I was a little bit underwhelmed with. And I think I went through 4 or 5 revisions of the design. And again, each time you kind of you can go online, you see a little line drawing of the configuration. There's a little note from your design helper. You kind of write back and say, here's what I'd like to change. And then 24 hours later, you get another revision in your inbox. Once you get through all of that, you basically send an email to your design person and say, yes, revision whatever is the one I want to go with. I am ready to go. They basically flick some switch, and then you can go to that same webpage where you've been reviewing your designs, type in your credit card number, you sort of click yes, I'm locked in, I accept. And after, I think another 24 hours or so, you get a shipping estimate. And it's sort of hey, it'll be, I think in my case it said 5 to 7 weeks. I can't remember if it was weeks or a date range, but ultimately predicted between 5 to 7 weeks. And in my case, it took about 8 weeks for the actual shelves to arrive. They generally ship via ocean freight. They're coming from the UK again, so they get built, get put on a boat, come over here, and then a freight company ultimately delivers the packages to you. In my case, they called me the night before. They're a little non-specific on what time they would arrive, and they ultimately came into my neighborhood and were there when I was out at one of my son's football games. So I had them just leave all the stuff on the front stoop and got home from the football game to Christmas in October with a whole bunch of big cardboard boxes on my front porch. Now, in terms of installing this stuff, I think Vitsoe has some language on their website and basically says, it's not that hard, but if you're not comfortable, hire somebody or get a helper. And I think that's pretty reasonable advice. If you've drilled holes in drywall, if you kind of understand at a relatively basic level how walls work, in my case, I have traditional wood framing with sheetrock over it, which is probably the case of 85, 90% of the homes in America. I'm aware of how walls are built. I've built walls, all that stuff. So I'm probably on the more advanced side of the equation. But if you've, gone and hung drywall anchors, if you kind of understand that, yes, there's studs back there, you need to look for them and you need to, react differently if you find a stud versus not finding a stud. If you're comfortable, drilling into a wall, making sure you don't hit electrical or plumbing or whatever the heck else is back there. And you're comfortable operating a tape measure, which, sounds dumb, but, measurement in this thing is obviously fairly key. Then I think you can do it. The only specialized tools you really need is you need a power drill. I liked having a power driver in addition to the drill. And then you basically just need a tape measure and a pencil. And I would say you definitely do need a helper. Some of the cabinets, I think I ended up getting 4 cabinets, are fairly heavy and they're kind of bulky and they're a little bit challenging to install by yourself. You could probably do it, but you're probably going to scratch up your walls and or jack up your new highly expensive shelving system. So if nothing else, having a buddy come over for the part where you actually hang your cabinets on the wall will be helpful, unless you're just going with the shelving units. The shelving units are probably 7-8 pounds each, and other than a little bit of an awkward balancing act and kind of pretending to be a waiter balancing your tray, those are pretty easy to install yourself. The only other slightly more advanced tool is you might want a stud finder. I find the knocking on the wall trick generally works well enough, but a stud finder might be helpful, and I'll link down in the show notes to my kind of list of advanced homeowner tools where you can find all sorts of goofy stuff to basically do something relatively straightforward like installing these shelves up to, framing a bathroom or something like that. In terms of the only other tool you really need, Vitsoe gives you this specialized level, which is kind of cool. It basically has 2 prongs on either end, so you can use that to stick it in a rail once you've got that hung up, and put the other rail next to it so it ensures proper spacing. And you can go and level your first rail with the level, obviously, and then you kind of do everything else off of that first rail. And that level will make sure your spacing's correct, and then kind of verify that it's spaced correctly throughout the whole thing. So as long as your first rail is level and plumb and kind of installed perfectly, your others should be good as well. And essentially the installation process is nothing more than kind of some measuring, again, for that first rail, making sure you've got it pretty much perfect. And, I would measure a couple or 3 times just to verify that, leveling that first rail, and then you kind of mount one screw in that first rail as well as the subsequent rails, level the thing again, mark out the other 7 holes. There's 8 holes for each wall mount. And then it's just a matter of drilling, putting in the anchors they supply you, which are fairly nice, high-grade hardware that should hold up fairly robustly, getting that rail in and kind of screw it all the way down, and then using that level tool to set up your next rail and repeating the same process. The instructions are pretty clear. They're actually in English. It's not just pictographs, so it's obviously a lot easier than IKEA. There are a few little tips in there and kind of nuances that you have to kind of figure out as you go, since the wording doesn't fully explain it. But I'll try and talk you through some of that in some of the installation and general tips. So in terms of some of those tips, like most things, after I got the first wall mount in and got my first shelf up, the subsequent pieces of the installation were pretty easy, but here's kind of what I discovered along the way. So first off, that level is pretty ingenious. Again, you use it both to level the first wall mount, obviously, and then to kind of ensure your spacing in your level of your second and subsequent rails is perfect. A key thing to remember there is that aluminum is a little bit flexible. And the reason that's important is because basically, you install your first wall mount, you go and put your second one up, you level at the top, screw in the top, then they suggest that you level at the bottom and kind of mark out all your holes. What I did on one of my wall mounts was I put the level in the bottom, between the 2 holes, and I was putting a little bit of sideways pressure on that rail to make sure that the level stayed in. And ultimately that caused the rail to bow, just a tiny bit, probably a millimeter, maybe half a millimeter. It didn't affect my installation, but when I was putting some of the shelves in, I could sort of feel that that one didn't align as well as the rest of them because that spacing was off just a little bit from kind of poking that wall mount from the side. So what I would suggest is, after you level out the topmost hole in your rail and you get that guy screwed in, if you put the level tool down in a lower hole and kind of get everything lined up, apply pressure straight into the wall. That way your wall mount isn't bending or anything. You're holding the level in and making sure everything kind of stays aligned as you mark off the holes, but you're doing it by making sure that that wall mount is sort of pushed against the wall versus kind of pushed in and potentially bowing a little bit. Next couple of tips, I think I mentioned measure a couple or 3 times for that first rail. Everything goes off of that. That leveling tool is great. It saves you a bunch of time and having to do some convoluted measurements to install your subsequent wall mounts. But if you don't get the first one right and you don't really make sure that's perfectly level, then any tiny errors will start to be magnified as you put several of those additional wall mounts on. In my case, I had 4 of them, and by the end it was maybe a degree out of level. It was probably an 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch off of where exactly I thought it would be on the end of the wall. So that stuff could add up if you had a 10-bay system or some very long and elaborate type of setup. And I would frankly, if I had more than maybe 5 wall mounts, do a couple of audits along the way and just check and make sure everything was still level, still measuring kind of where I thought it would be, and everything was sort of course, was going according to plan. The other tip I give you on the wall mounting piece is drill pilot holes. If you try and go with the drill bit that they supply you, which is the right size for the drywall mounting toggles that they supply, I think it's a 1/4 inch bit or something like that, so it's a pretty big honking bit. If you try and just drill into drywall without a pilot hole with that guy, it's pretty easy to slip. It's pretty easy once you start drilling for it to skid a little bit, and then you end up with a big honking hole that's a 1/4 inch off from where you need it to be, and then your mount's not going to be in the right place. The holes in the wall mount are fairly tight tolerance, so you don't have a lot of wiggle room. So I would just grab a 32nd or a 16th or a smaller bit and use that to drill your pilot holes. If you haven't done a lot of drilling into drywall, the trick I usually do when I drill pilot holes, I'll go and measure out where I want the holes in the wall mount. I'll just sort of scribble in the whole hole so I have a good idea of where that's going to be. And then I'll take my smaller drill bit, I'll get that right in the center of the hole, and I'll apply a little pressure before I start the drill, so it essentially pokes a hole or a little divot into the drywall. And then you can back off on the pressure. That little divot will keep your drill bit in one place, guide you in nice and easy. And the other tip I'd give you on drilling into drywall, both for your pilot hole and your larger hole, if you've got fiberglass insulation behind where you're drilling, go in there, drill your hole, and then put the drill in reverse and back it out that way. If you keep the drill spinning and kind of pull it out, you'll get a little puff of fiberglass coming out. And ideal, you can just kind of ram it in when you put in that drywall anchor. But that way you don't have a bunch of fiberglass junk sticking out that makes it a little more difficult to put in your drywall anchor. Now, in terms of installing the cabinets and all that stuff, a few tips there. The cabinets are the heaviest piece of the product. I have a 3-drawer one that's probably 60, 70 pounds. So if you're a strong dude, you could probably lift it yourself, but you're gonna have a heck of a time lifting it, holding it, manipulating it, putting in the pins and all that stuff. So just get an extra person. It's gonna make your life a lot easier. The other tip of those cabinets is the drawers will come out. Anything you have in the system that has drawers in it, they're generally pretty easy to pop out. You can kind of just lift them off and they'll come off the tracks, and then you go to reinstall them. You can just kind of line the drawer up, push it in, and you'll hear a whole bunch of clicks. It almost sounds and feels a little bit like you're breaking something, but that's just all the kind of drawer slides locking back into place. That also makes your life a lot easier since you kind of get all that stuff out, and then you can put your hand in there and have another place to lift and hold those big cabinets as you're trying to install them. In terms of the little pins that you use to install the system, and you can see some, I'll put some detailed video, you can probably see some more details on the Vitsoe website. But the way the whole system works is the wall track has, holes obviously that go into your wall, and then it has kind of cross-drilled holes where you put little aluminum pins, and the shelving will have a hole and a little notch on it that you jam that pin through, and that's how the stuff essentially stays attached to the wall. So it's pretty simple. The pins almost seem like they're a bit too small and cute looking to hold up a big heavy shelf, but it seems to work for people with massive collections of books and all that stuff. But they give you a tip in the installation manual that didn't quite make sense to me when I first read it, and it probably won't really make sense as I try and explain it here, but try this a few times with one of the bookshelves since it's light and it's relatively easy to manipulate. But the tip they give you is to kind of stage the pins. So the shelves and stuff that you're hanging have a hole, so the pin has to go through it. You can't just kind of put the pin in and then hook it over like some of the other alpha type systems. But what you can do is you can kind of have that pin and have it hanging just on the inside of the wall mount. So it's not covering the 2 channels where any of your shelves go, but it's just kind of hanging out there. And the benefit to that is you can get your shelving unit, and this is particularly relevant with the big shelves, kind of into position. Your pin's already staged, so you know where you're trying to go. And once you kind of get that hole lined up, you can push that guy in, and he's sort of pre-staged and he'll go and ultimately hook up there. Where this gets a little bit challenging is if you have multiple heavy cabinets that are all at the same level. In my system, I have 3 pretty big heavy cabinets as sort of a base that are all lined up so I can get that nice smooth surface that I can do my work on and my paper sorting and all that stuff I talked about at the beginning. And I really try to think through, how am I going to install these? How am I going to plan it out? How am I going to kind of pre-position my pins? Because when you're installing 2 things side by side, they're in each side of that little channel, and you kind of have to get your pin pre-positioned and then make sure you only go halfway through so you still have that other channel occupied or that other channel free. So when you put the next cabinet in, you can drive that guy all the way home. So, again, if you have a couple of the bookshelf type units, I might try not even putting them in final position, but trying putting them next to each other, seeing how the pins work, seeing kind of the approach that works best for you on pre-positioning those. Because what you don't want to do is, have your helper and you carrying that 60-pound thing, trying to figure out, which hole am I supposed to put it in, and then realizing that the pins are 5 feet over there, or, trying to grab the pin and jam the thing in while you're holding it and all that stuff. So the more you can pre-position the pins and make life easy on yourself, the better the installation piece is going to go. And on that note, I would plan for having to redo everything, at least once. In my initial design, one of the things that was a little bit off and that kind of disappointed me with that whole design process was generally you don't want 2 components to be off center. And the reasoning for that is if I have, let's say this is the side of a shelf, and pardon my janky finger, it doesn't straighten out anymore due to a mountain biking accident. But if I have a shelf here, and actually we'll use the janky finger, let's say that's the pin right there. So that's gonna go all the way through both tracks, and there's kind of 2 channels in the track. And then if I wanted to put a bookshelf over here and it's banging into that pin, it's gonna be a little bit proud of the wall. And if it's a shelf, it's gonna be a little bit angled. So, if you're putting something on there that was rolling or something like that, it could roll down. It just looks a little goofy, and it's, not the end of the world. It's maybe a couple degrees, but it just looked goofy. So I had to tweak my design a little bit so that things would, again, if this was my pin holding up my big shelf, I could put my bookshelf next to it if they shared the same hole, and I wouldn't have that issue where the shelf was now proud. If I hung it up here on another pin, that's where it would bump into this pin and it would hang out proud of the wall. So to the extent you can kind of vet your design and make sure that if you've got two things in two bays that are next to each other, they're sharing the same pin, you shouldn't run into that issue. So some final thoughts and kind of my analysis on would I, pony up and buy this thing again, having installed it, having used it for a couple weeks and all that stuff. So bottom line up front, yes, I would buy this thing again. It's one of those products where after I placed the initial order and was sort of sitting around waiting for 8 weeks for it to arrive, I was second guessing myself quite a bit. I was sort of like, hey, was that really worth it? Did I really spend that much on shelves? Is this stuff going to look nice? Is it going to be functional? Is it going to be high quality? All that stuff. And ultimately, as I was installing it, I was pretty impressed with the quality of the components. I was pretty impressed with little things like the packaging is almost all cardboard and there's no staples, there's very little tape or anything like that. So you can kind of disassemble all the packaging. It's nice and flat. The Vitsoe people say you can use that to store it. So when you move it, you can pack it back up in the boxes. I don't know how the hell you'd remember how to reassemble everything and which shapes went with which components. So I ultimately took it to the recycling center. It was a lot easier to kind of disassemble and have a big stack of flat cardboard than have a 30-foot tall stack of big old boxes. And there's a lot of just nice touches as you start to use the thing. The components are clearly well built. It's a nice combination of, I don't know if it's Formica or what the counter material is, but it feels nice. It's kind of a nice color. There's aluminum as kind of the other major material. It looks nice. Everything's kind of assembled very nicely. All the drawers are soft close. Everything's pretty heavy duty. It's just one of those things where it looks and feels like a quality product. I also like that, it's been around since the 60s, so the design, clearly has some longevity to it. I like the fact that, if I want to add or change things, and there's probably a couple little tweaks that I'll make as I move forward with the system. Theoretically, the company will still be around. They've been doing this for 50 years, so they're doing okay thus far. I'll be able to get, new components. If something breaks, I'll be able to get components. They tell you if you move to a different place and you have a different type of wall, or you can change to sort of different hanging methodologies. They'll give you the materials you need to ultimately execute that. So that's all kind of good stuff. In terms of the negatives, the price we've talked about and kind of beaten to death. I think that's one of those things I'll get over. Products that I like and that I find effective and that I use on a daily basis. Ultimately, you kind of forget about the price after a while. And it's ultimately equivalent to maybe 2 or 3 reasonably high-end laptops, and hopefully it'll last me longer than 2 or 3 reasonably high-end laptops would at the end of the day. I wish the design process had been a little bit more engaging, effective. There's a couple things that I think my system is missing. I didn't even know that there were metal shelves that you can slide into some of the cabinets. I'm probably going to add at least one of those, and again, it's kind of nice that I can order that after the fact and put that in. I might have maybe ordered one of the cabinets with, you can order a open back or a back with some holes in it, so you could run wires in there. I might have hid my Sonos in one of the cabinets had I known that was an option. Yes, I could have figured all that out by looking through the rather extensive catalog of every piece and read every description, every note. But by the same token, some element of that pricing includes access to that designer. I wish the designer had been a little more helpful, a little bit more engaging, kind of said, hey, I see, you mentioned you're gonna put some, a Sonos in there. Have you thought where you're gonna put it? Maybe one open back. Or, hey, you've ordered 2 of these big old cabinets, did you know you could slide a shelf in there and that would be a way to get some more space? So, minor complaint. I think ultimately, even if I did want to add those backs to the cabinet, you can unscrew the backs relatively easy and replace them. So, not the end of the world. Obviously those little shelves are relatively easy to add. Hopefully they don't take another 8 weeks to come from the unicorn land in England. I expected a little bit more at the price point and with all the hype around these designers and kind of the services they offered. So at the end of the day, I think I'm fairly happy with the system. It works for me. I might tweak the configuration a little bit. Again, every 12 to 18 months, I try and take everything out of my drawers and see what I got and see if I need to move things around. So I do have that option. Is this system right for you? I think the price is probably a toughish pill to swallow, but if you're looking at built-ins, if you're looking at custom cabinetry, then you're probably not too far off in terms of price. If your competition is, hey, I'm gonna get a couple of those IKEA Alex units and spend $300, that's a pretty big leap to go from that type of setup to something like this. So, maybe you can justify it if you're gonna move it around and reconfigure it and buy pieces and all that stuff. I wouldn't recommend going into debt for a shelf. You know, if you're gonna take on debt, at least buy something that goes bang or, you know, has a catalytic converter or can do wheelies or something cool like that. But if you're looking for, you know, something that gives you that certain aesthetic, you know, gets you out of the mode of having some giant piece of furniture, gives you a little bit of that reconfigurability. You know, I assume if you were like an apartment dweller and wanted something that was functional, reconfigurable, and that you could move between apartments, this might be a pretty neat option, although, you know, I don't know how your landlord would feel about leaving 36 holes in the wall, but that's kind of something you'd have to ask him or her. Great design, you know, looks nice, well built, highly functional, pretty easy and straightforward to install. You know, theoretically has that longevity factor and has a 50-year track record to prove it versus just, you know, some words on a website. If you can balance that all off against the high cost of entry, it's a pretty cool system, and, you know, something that's unique, something that's a little different, something that's not your typical, you know, IKEA or mass market type furniture. So those are my thoughts on Vitsoe. Hopefully this helped you if you're kind of in the market and considering this stuff. It doesn't cost you anything to go through that quote process on the website. I have no connection to the company, so, you know, doing so doesn't help or hinder me in any way, shape, or form. But if you do that, you know, you can at least get some rough idea of pricing and kind of see how the system might look in your environment, since they do use your measurements and all that stuff. So with that, I think it's time to put this video on the shelf, and I will wish you much peace, prosperity, and excellence in shelving. Big Heavy, signing off. Peace.
Ever wonder why every talking head on YouTube asks you to hit the like and subscribe button at the end of their video? You were right, because we're living in a computer simulation. And our benevolent robotic overlords get just a little bit of energy every time you hit that like. So do me, the rest of civilization, and our benevolent robotic overlords a favor. Mash that subscribe, be kind to each other, keep living your simulated dreams.